The first time I saw Wade Coleman cry. He was 26 years old and holding something the whole county had already decided to hate. I want to be honest about that, because I've spent 40 years keeping a ledger of every important thing that's happened in this valley. First frosts, last calves, who got married, who got buried, the year the creek ran dry and the year it nearly drowned us. And I've learned that most of the truth gets lost the second people start telling it the way they wish it had gone. So I'll tell you the way it went, not the way it should have. Not the way the men down at the feed store tell it now, leaning on the counter like they were there. It was the second week of April. I remember because I'd just written Cottonwood's budding, late, cold spring in the corner of the page, and I'd circled it the way I circle things I want to remember. And then I'd looked up from my own porch and seen Wade's truck coming down the county road too fast, kicking up a tail of dust that hung in the gray morning light like something that didn't want to settle. I'm Eli Hartstone, in case it matters. I run the place that borders Wade's on the north, or I ran it. I'm mostly retired now, and the cattle are more memory than money. My wife Connie passed 6 years before any of this, and I'd be lying if I said the quiet hadn't gotten into my bones by then. A man alone gets into the habit of watching other people's lives the way some folks watch the weather. Not nosy, just keeping track, just making sure the world's still turning over out there past my fence line. So I watched Wade's truck slow at his gate, watched it sit there idling while he didn't get out, and I knew, the way you know things about a neighbor whose whole short, hard life you've half witnessed, that something had broken in him that morning. I didn't know yet what it was. I want to back up. You have to understand what Wade had inherited, because the wolf pup didn't land in an easy life. It landed in a life that was already coming apart at the seams. His father, Carl Coleman, had been a hard man in the way a lot of men out here were hard, not cruel exactly, but worn down to something sharp, like a tool that's been used past its purpose. Carl ran the ranch on stubbornness and credit, and he ran his son the same way. I'd watched Wade grow up on the other side of the fence, a quiet boy who'd learned early to read the weather of his father's moods, and I'd watched him stay when most boys with sense would have left, stayed through the bad years, the bank years, the year Carl's lungs started giving out from 40 years of dust and cigarettes. Carl died the November before. Wade buried him on a Tuesday with maybe 9 people standing in the cold, and I was one of them, and I remember thinking, that boy has no idea what's coming. Because here's what Carl left him: 300 head of cattle, give or take, on land that couldn't really carry that many. A mortgage Carl had quietly let go sideways in his last sick years, a loan against the equipment, and a name, Coleman, that meant something specific in Arden County, which is to say it meant cattlemen, the way it had for 3 generations, the way it was supposed to mean for Wade. Out here, the Cattlemen's Association isn't a club. It's the closest thing we've got to a church and a government rolled together. The men who sit on it decide whose word is good, whose loans get co-signed, who gets the grazing leases on the federal land up in the high country, and that grazing lease was the only thing that made Wade's whole operation pencil out. Without the summer range up in the national forest, his herd would eat his home pasture to dirt by August, and he'd be selling at a loss by fall. With it he had a chance, a thin one but a chance. So Wade needed those men. He needed Holly's Brandt, who chaired the association and had the lease renewals in his pocket. He needed his father's old friends, who were watching the dead man's son to see if he'd be a Coleman or not. That's the life the pup landed in. That's what everyone meant when they said it would ruin him. It happened up in the dries. That's what we call the broken country to the west, all juniper and rimrock and old lava beds, government land that nobody much wants. Wade had ridden up there that morning to check a stretch of fence before he pushed cattle up for the early grass. I got the rest of it later in pieces from Wade himself, on a night I'll get to. There'd been a den. Wolves had come back into this country maybe a dozen years before, reintroduced up north and spread down, and the cattlemen hated them the way you hate a thing that costs you money in the dark, which is to say completely and without complication. A pack had killed 2 of Holly's Brandt's calves that spring. So Holly's had done what men out here do. He'd found the den, and he'd dealt with it. When Wade rode up on that rimrock, the wolves were already dead. The adults, the yearlings, poison or a rifle or both, I never knew and didn't want to. He found them scattered in the rocks below the den mouth, stiff with the cold, and he sat his horse there in the gray light looking at it, and he was about to ride on. He told me that. I was about to just ride on, Eli. I'd have ridden on. That's the part I can't. And then something moved in the rocks. One pup, small enough to fit in 2 hands. Late born, runt of the litter, too little to have followed the others out to whatever they'd gotten into. It had crawled out of the den and was lying against the cold body of what I suppose was its mother, not understanding, the way the very young don't understand, that the warmth it was looking for was never coming back. Wade told me it didn't even run from him. It was too weak. It just looked up at him. Those eyes, Eli, God, those eyes weren't even open all the way, and made a sound he said he'd never been able to describe and never been able to forget. Not a growl, not a howl, just a small, lost animal sound that meant the only thing it could mean. He got down off his horse. He told himself he was going to do the merciful thing. Out here you learn to do the merciful thing young. I've done it more times than I can count, and it never gets easier, and the men who tell you it does are lying or broken. He took out his knife. He knelt down in the rocks. And he couldn't. He knelt there in the cold next to a litter of dead wolves with a knife in his hand, and a thing the size of his fist looking up at him. And the man who just buried a father he couldn't save, who'd spent his whole life being told that softness was the thing that kills you out here. That man took off his jacket and wrapped the pup up in it and carried it down the mountain inside his coat against his own chest, because it was cold, and because it was alive. And because for once in his life, he was just done watching things die that he could have kept. That's what was in the truck. That's what I saw him carry through his gate that gray April morning, after he'd sat there idling too long, working up the nerve to bring it into the only life he had. I didn't go over that first day. I'm ashamed to say it now, but I'd learned the hard way that grief doesn't want company until it asks for it, and I figured whatever was wrong over there was Wade's to carry. I just watched the lights in his barn stay on long past when they should have gone dark, and I wrote in my ledger, "Coleman boy up all night, something wrong," and I circled it. It was Marisol who came to me first. Marisol Reyes ran the valley's only veterinary practice out of a converted horse trailer and a clinic the size of a single-car garage, and she'd been doctoring half the animals in 3 counties for going on 15 years. She was maybe 40 then, sharp-tongued, kind in the way that doesn't announce itself, the daughter of a man who'd shoed horses here before her, and the only person in the valley I'd have trusted with Connie's dog when Connie was dying. She pulled up my drive 2 days after the truck, and she didn't waste words. "You're his neighbor," she said. "You knew his father." Knew him as well as anybody let themselves. "He's got a wolf pup in his barn, Eli." She said it flat, watching my face. 2-3 weeks old. He's been getting up every 2 hours through the night to bottle it. Drove down to my place at 4 in the morning because it wouldn't take the milk and he thought it was dying. She rubbed her eyes. I could see she hadn't slept either. I switched him to a different formula. It took. But he was, Eli, he was shaking. Over a wolf that's going to. She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. "Holly's know?" I asked. "Holly's is going to know by Sunday," she said. "You can't keep a thing like that quiet in this valley, and you know it. And when he knows," she looked off toward Wade's place, toward the barn with its lights that wouldn't go dark. "That boy's whole future is sitting in Holly's Brandt's good graces, and he just took in the one animal Holly's hates most in the world. Out of spite, half of them are going to say, or out of stupidity, and they're going to make him choose." I knew she was right. I'd lived here long enough to feel the shape of what was coming the way you feel a storm in your knees. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. She was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing that got me off my porch. Because he doesn't have anybody, Eli. He buried the last person he had in November, and I've patched up enough animals to know the difference between a man who's keeping something and a man who's holding on. That boy is holding on, and I'm afraid of what happens to him when they make him let go. I went over that evening. Wade's place was the same wreck it had been under Carl's sagging barn, equipment that should have been junked a decade ago, the house dark except for one window. But the barn glowed, and when I came up to the open door I stopped, because I didn't want to break whatever it was I was looking at. He was sitting in the straw with his back against a stall post, and he had the pup in the crook of his arm, and he was feeding it from a bottle the size of my thumb. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't, by the look of him, done much of anything but this. And he was talking to it low, steady, the way you talk to a thing you've decided to keep. And what he was saying, when I got close enough to hear, was, "Okay, you're okay, I got you. I'm not going anywhere, you hear me? I'm right here." I have not been able to forget that in all the years since. I'm not going anywhere, from a man who'd had everyone go. He looked up and saw me and went red, the way the young do when you catch them being soft, and he started to say something defensive, and I held up a hand. "Marisol sent me," I said, "and I've buried more of these than you've had hot dinners, so don't waste your breath telling me it's foolish. I know it's foolish." I lowered myself down into the straw across from him, my knees announcing every year of their age. "Tell me how you found it." So he did. The rimrock, the dead pack, the knife he couldn't use. He told it badly, in pieces, stopping and starting, and somewhere in the middle of it his voice came apart, and he just stopped and sat there with his jaw working and the pup nursing in his arm, and I let him. I've learned that much. You let a man find his own way back from the edge of saying too much. When he had himself again, he looked at me, and there was something terrible and young in his face, and he said, "Everybody's gonna tell me to put it down, aren't they?" "Yes," I said, no point lying to him. "Holly's is gonna pull my lease." "He might." "I can't lose the lease, Eli. I lose the lease, I lose the herd. I lose the herd, I lose the ranch. I lose the ranch." He stopped. The math of his whole life ran out into silence. "It's everything my dad, it's 3 generations. I'd be the Coleman who lost it, over a wolf." "That's true," I said. I wasn't going to soften it. I respected him too much for that. "Every word of it's true." He looked down at the pup. It had fallen asleep mid-nurse, the way the very young do, milk on its muzzle, one paw twitching at some dream too small to know about. And I watched Wade Coleman look at it, and I watched him do the math again, and I watched him arrive, God help him, at the same answer he'd arrived at on the rimrock with the knife in his hand. "I can't do it," he whispered. "I already couldn't do it once. I can't do it now." He looked up at me, and he wasn't asking permission. I want to be clear about that. He was telling me. I'm so tired of letting things go, Eli. I let my mom go. I let my dad go, and I couldn't do anything. I just watched him, and I'm so tired of standing there watching things die that I could have. He didn't finish it. I didn't make him. Here is the thing nobody tells you about the merciful thing, the practical thing, the smart thing. Sometimes it's just the cold thing wearing a respectable coat. I'd done the smart thing my whole life. I'd sold off Connie's horse when she got too sick to ride because it was the practical move and we needed the money, and she never said a word about it, and I have regretted it every single day since because I took the one thing that still got her out into the sun. I did the smart thing. The valley would have told me I did the smart thing. And it was the coldest thing I ever did, and I'll carry it to my grave. So when that boy sat in the straw and told me he couldn't do the smart thing, some part of me that had been clenched shut for 6 years came open. "All right," I said. He blinked. "All right what?" "All right, you're keeping it." I got to my feet, knees complaining. "Which means you've got about 4 days before Holly's Brant knows, and you'd best have your spine set before he does, because that man can smell weakness like a coyote smells a dropped calf, and he will take everything you've got if you flinch. So you're not going to flinch." I looked down at him. You're going to keep this thing alive and you're going to keep your ranch. And I'm going to help you do both. Because I'm an old man with nothing better to do, and I am sick to death of watching this valley make people sorry for the soft parts of themselves. He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Why, he said. I almost told him about the horse. I didn't. Some things you keep. Because somebody should have helped your dad, I said instead, and nobody did. Now finish feeding that thing and go to sleep. You look like death. It got worse before it got better. I won't pretend it didn't. Hollies knew by Saturday, not Sunday. These things always move faster than you brace for. He didn't come himself. Men like Hollies never come themselves first. He sent Del Murphy, one of his hands, with a message dressed up as neighborly concern. Hollies heard Wade had himself a problem up in the dries, and Hollies sure hoped Wade was going to handle it sensible. On account of the lease renewals were coming up, and Hollies would hate for there to be any questions about whether Wade had his priorities straight, him being so new to running things and all. Wade told me about it that night, white-knuckled, and I watched him understand for the first time the true shape of the thing he'd taken on. It wasn't going to be one hard choice. It was going to be 100 small ones, every week, for as long as he kept that animal, a slow grind of pressure designed to make him give it up and call it his own idea. And the pup, meanwhile, had no notion of any of it. It was getting stronger. Marisol came by twice that first week, refusing payment, and pronounced it female and a fighter. Its eyes opened the rest of the way, and Wade was right. There was something in them, that pale wolf gold that looks at you like it's reading something written behind your face. It started to play. It chewed everything. It followed Wade around the barn on legs too big for it, falling over its own feet, and the first time it managed a clumsy little howl, more squeak than howl, Wade laughed out loud, and I realized I hadn't heard the boy laugh once since his father died. He still wouldn't name it. I noticed that. Marisol noticed it too. She asked him one afternoon, "You going to call her something or just her forever?" And Wade got quiet and busy with the feed and didn't answer, and Marisol caught my eye over his bent head, and neither of us pushed it. I knew why. I think she did too. You don't name a thing you're afraid you'll have to bury. You don't name a thing the whole world is trying to make you give away. As long as it was just the pup, it could still be a foolishness, a phase, a thing a grieving man would come to his senses about. A name would make it real. A name would make it his. And Wade Coleman had learned in 26 hard years exactly what it cost to let yourself have something. So he fed her and warmed her and got up through the nights for her and loved her, plainly, completely, the way I think he'd been wanting to love something for a long time. And he wouldn't give her a name, because a name was a door, and he wasn't ready yet to walk through it knowing what was on the other side. The breaking point of that first stretch came 3 weeks in, and it came the way these things do, sideways, when you're braced for it to come head-on. It wasn't Hollies, it was money. A calf went down sick, then 2, then a fence gave in a storm and Wade lost half a day's diesel chasing strays, and the bank, Carl's old slid-sideways loan finally surfacing, sent the kind of letter that doesn't use the word foreclosure but means it in every line. Wade sat at his father's kitchen table with that letter and a calculator, and the wolf pup asleep in a box by the wood stove, and he ran the numbers the way his father had taught him. And the numbers said what numbers say. You can't afford softness. You never could. Sell the herd while it's worth something, take the least deal Hollies is dangling, do the smart thing, the practical thing, the thing your father would have done. He called me near midnight. I'd never heard him sound like that. Eli, just my name cracked down the middle. I'm here. I think I have to give her up. A long, terrible breath. I think I have to take Hollies' deal, and I think the deal's gonna come with conditions, and I think we both know what the condition's gonna be, and I think if I don't, I lose the whole place, and Eli, I can't be the one who loses it. I can't. I'd rather. He stopped. I don't know what I'd rather, that's the problem. I don't know anything anymore. And I sat there in my dark kitchen with the phone against my ear, an old man who'd sold a dying woman's horse to do the smart thing. And I had to decide right then what to tell that boy. I could have told him to do the practical thing. It would even have been good advice. Solid, defensible, the kind of advice that lets everyone sleep. Instead I said, "Wade, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anybody, and then you're going to decide, and I'm going to back you either way." And I told him about the horse. I told him all of it. The selling, the practical math, the way Connie never said a word, the way I'd find her at the window some mornings looking out at the empty corral, the way I never let myself understand until after she was gone that I'd taken her last good thing and called it sense. I told him that I'd done every smart thing a man can do in a hard country, and that the smart things were the only things I regretted, every single one, and that I was 71 years old and alone in a house full of the smart decisions I'd made, and that I would give all of it, the solvent ranch, the full bank account, the respect of every cattleman in Ardent County. I would give the whole sorry pile of it back in a heartbeat for one more morning of watching Connie ride out into the sun on a horse I'd been too smart to keep. The line was quiet for a long time. "So what do I do?" Wade finally said, barely a whisper. "I'm not going to tell you that," I said. "I'm just telling you that 30 years from now, you're not going to be sitting alone in a kitchen wishing you'd done the smart thing. Nobody ever is. So whatever you decide, decide it knowing that." He didn't answer. After a while he just said, "Thanks, Eli," and hung up, and I sat there the rest of the night not knowing what I'd done, whether I'd helped him or ruined him, whether the truest thing I knew was also the most dangerous thing I could have handed a desperate man. I found out the next morning. I'd barely slept. At first light I drove over, half afraid of what I'd find, and Wade's truck was gone, and the house was empty, and my heart dropped clean through the floor of me because I thought, he's gone to take Holly's deal. I pushed him the wrong way. The boy's gone to do the thing he can live with instead of the thing he can't. And then I heard it. Out behind the barn, in the home pasture, in the long gold light of an early spring morning, a laugh. Wade's laugh. And under it, that ridiculous half-grown squeak howl, and the drum of clumsy paws, and I came around the corner of the barn and stopped dead. He'd let her out into the open. The first time I'd find out he'd ever trusted her loose in the wide world. And she was running flat out, ears back, all 4 oversized feet flying, the pure mad joy of a young thing that has just discovered that the world is big, and Wade was running after her. This grim, broke, grieving boy, running through the wet grass in his sock feet with his arms out, laughing like I hadn't known he had it in him. And when she wheeled and came barreling back at him, he dropped down into the grass and she hit him full speed and knocked him flat, and they went over together in a tangle. And he lay there in the wet morning laughing up at the sky, with a wolf pup standing on his chest, licking the salt off his face. I didn't go to them. I stood at the corner of the barn and I let them have it. He saw me after a minute. He sat up in the grass, the pup squirming in his lap, and across that whole bright pasture he looked at me, and he was crying. I could see it even from there, but it was the other kind, the kind I hadn't seen on a human face in longer than I could remember, and he called out to me the only thing he needed to say. "I'm keeping her, Eli." 4 words. The lease, the herd, the ranch, the Coleman name, Holly's brand, and the whole weight of a hard country, and he set every bit of it down in the wet grass and chose the soft thing, the foolish thing, the only thing he knew for certain he could live with. "I figured you might," I called back. And then, because she'd done it, because she'd been the one to run him down and knock him flat and lick the grief right off his face, because in choosing to keep her he'd finally let himself walk through the door, he scooped her up against his chest and he said it. The name. The first time. Loud enough to carry across the whole pasture to where I stood. "Come on then," he told her. "Come on, Hope." I wrote it in my ledger that night. Coleman boy named the wolf, Hope. God help them both. And then, because I'm an honest man and the ledger only takes the truth, I crossed out God help them both and wrote instead what I'd seen in that pasture. The thing I didn't have a name for yet but would come to understand by the end of that long, hard, blessed year. Maybe she's the help. What none of us knew that morning, not me, not Marisol, not Wade laughing in the wet grass with a named wolf in his arms, was that the hard part hadn't started yet. That choosing to keep her had only bought him the right to fight for her. That Holly's Brant does not lose, and a man who's just been told no by a boy he meant to break does not simply walk away. I'd like to tell you the face belonged to Holly's Brant, because that would be simpler, and because there's a kind of comfort in having one man to hate. But the truth is harder than that, and the ledger only takes the truth. The face that nearly ended it all belonged to a boy of 11 named Tobias Brant, Holly's grandson, and the worst part, the part I still turn over some nights, is that he never meant a lick of harm. I'll get there. I have to lay the summer down first, the way it actually came. That spring, after Wade chose her in the wet grass, there'd been a stretch I'd call almost peaceful if I didn't know what was crouched at the end of it. Holly's had gone quiet. Too quiet. I told Wade as much, I said. A man like that doesn't lose interest, son. He changes tools. But Wade was young and tired and happy in a way he hadn't let himself be in years, and a happy man doesn't want to hear about the weather coming. Hope had grown into the ranch like she'd been poured into it. She shadowed Wade everywhere out to the home pasture in the gray morning, up onto the seat of the truck with her head out the window and her tongue going, into the barn at night where she'd flop down in the straw with a sigh like an old man settling into a chair. She'd worked out, somewhere in that wolf brain of hers, that the cattle were Wade's, and so the cattle were hers, and she took to them the way a good dog takes to a flock, patrolling the fence line, lifting her head at things Wade couldn't see or hear, trotting the perimeter at dusk like she was counting them. Marisol said it was instinct turned sideways. She's pack, she told me, leaning on her truck one evening watching Hope work the fence in the long light. She doesn't have a pack, so she made one out of whatever was here. Him, the cattle, you when you're around. She shook her head and there was something soft and sad in it. It's the saddest, most beautiful thing I ever saw, Eli. She's just a kid who lost everybody, deciding to belong to somebody anyway. I knew she wasn't only talking about the wolf. The first crack came in late June, and it came as a dead calf. One of Wade's, found at the north fence with its throat torn out, and by the time Wade found it, the magpies and the heat had been at it, and there's no reading a thing like that once the country's had a day with it. Wade called me over and we stood looking at it, and I watched his face go gray, because we both knew what it would look like to anyone who wanted it to look a certain way. It wasn't her, Wade said. He said it fast before I could say anything, which is how I knew he was already afraid it might have been. Eli. She sleeps in the barn, she was in the barn, I know, I said, and I did know mostly. Hope had no more interest in killing Wade's cattle than she had in killing Wade, she guarded them. But I'd lived in this country long enough to know that what happened and what people decide happened are two different animals, and only one of them has teeth. Could have been the pack that's still up in the dries, I said. Could have been a lion. Could have been dogs. The Peterson place has those two that run loose. I crouched by the calf, what was left of it. But Wade, you listen to me now. It doesn't matter what it was. How does it not matter? Because by Sunday, half this valley's going to know a Coleman calf got killed, I said, and the other half's going to know Wade Coleman keeps a wolf. And those two facts are going to lie down together in people's heads and make a third fact that isn't true. And there's not one thing you can say that'll pry them apart. You understand me. The story's already written. All Holly's has to do is let it get told. Wade stood there with his hands hanging at his sides, looking down at the dead thing in the dirt, and I watched the happy summer go out of his face. So what do I do? He said. It was the same question he'd asked me on the phone in the dark, the night I told him about the horse. I didn't have as good an answer this time. You bury it deep, I said, and you pray nobody saw it first. and you keep that wolf so close she never gives anybody a single true thing to point at. Because the lie'll find its own legs. Don't you go handing it the truth to ride on. It wasn't enough. Of course it wasn't. Somebody had seen it or seen something, a shape at the fence at dusk, gray and four-legged, and that shape went into the valley's mouth and came out the other side as Coleman's wolf is killing stock. By the 4th of July it was settled fact at the feed store. I heard it myself, standing at the counter buying fence staples. 2 men I'd known 30 years talking about it like the weather. Heard the Coleman boy's wolf got into his own calves. Well, what'd he expect? You can't make a pet of a thing that's built to kill. It'll turn on you, always does, blood'll out. I almost said something. I'm ashamed I didn't. But I'd learned that defending a thing too hard at the feed store only convinces people you've got something to defend. So I bought my staples and I kept my mouth shut and I drove home with my jaw aching from clamping it. And that's its own kind of cowardice, and I knew it even then. And then Holly's made his move, and I understood that the dead calf had just been the ground softening before the plow. He came himself this time. That's how I knew it was serious. Men like Holly send a hand to deliver a warning, but they come in person to deliver an offer, because an offer's the kind of thing they want to watch land on your face. I happened to be at Wade's when his truck came down the drive. I'd taken to spending my evenings over there, telling myself it was to help with the haying, but really because the boy's company had put something back into my own days that I'd thought was gone for good. Hope saw the truck before either of us did. She came up off the porch with every hair on her standing and a low sound in her chest. I'd never heard from her, not playing now, all business, putting herself between Wade and the gate. Hold her, I said low. Whatever happens, you hold her. He'd love nothing better than for her to show teeth at him. Wade got a hand in her ruff. He had to use some strength. She didn't want to be held. Holly's got out slow. He was a big man gone heavy with age, expensive hat, the kind of unhurried movements a man earns when he's spent 40 years being the one other men wait on. He looked at the wolf for a long moment with no particular expression, and then he looked at Wade, and he smiled, and the smile was worse than the look. Wade, he said it warm like an uncle, hell of an animal, look at the size of her already. He took a step closer. Hope's growl climbed and Wade tightened his grip. Easy now, I'm not here about her. A pause perfectly placed. Not directly. Then what are you here about, Mr. Brandt? Wade kept his voice level. I was proud of him for that. Holly's took his time. He looked out over Wade's place, the sagging barn, the equipment, the herd in the middle distance, the way a man looks over something he's already decided he owns. I'm here about your future, son, he said. Lease renewals go to committee in September. I expect you know that. He let it sit. Now I'll be straight with you because I respected your daddy and that's worth something to me. There's talk about the calf, about the situation here, a glance at Hope. And the committee, well, they get nervous about a man's judgment. They want to know the men holding those federal leases are sound, sensible, the kind of cattleman who puts the operation first. You follow me? I follow you fine, Wade said. Good, Holly's nodded like they were getting somewhere pleasant. So here's what I can do for you. I can make the talk go away. I can stand up in that committee and tell them Carl Coleman's boy is sound. He had a soft spell after his daddy passed. God rest him, but he's come right and his lease ought to renew clean. I can do that. He smiled again. I'd be glad to do that for a neighbor. He let the rope play out. All I'd need, he said, is to be able to tell them it's handled, the situation, that you've come to your senses and dealt with the animal sensible like a man does. He spread his hands, reasonable as Sunday. You don't even have to, there's no unpleasantness required. There's people up north taking exotics, sanctuaries and such. She goes in a crate, she goes away. She lives out her days behind a fence somewhere far from here, and nobody has to do anything ugly. You keep your ranch. You keep your name. And a wild animal that was never meant to be in a man's barn goes and lives like a wild animal ought to. He looked at Wade, and the kindness in his face was the most dangerous thing I'd seen all summer. That's not cruelty, son. That's mercy, for her and for you. You'd be doing right by everybody, including yourself. And here's the thing that's haunted me. It was a good offer. That's what made it deadly. It wasn't put the wolf down. It was send the wolf to a green pasture up north and save your whole life and call it kindness. There was no villainy in it you could point to. A reasonable man would take it. A reasonable man would be a fool not to take it. Marisol herself, when she heard the terms later, sat down hard in a barn chair and put her face in her hands because even she couldn't say it was the wrong choice. A sanctuary, Eli, she'd be alive. She'd be safe. She'd be with her own kind, maybe. How do you tell a man not to take that? Hollis knew exactly what he'd built. He hadn't asked Wade to do something cruel. He'd asked Wade to do something good and made it cost him the one thing he wasn't sure he could survive losing twice, the pup on the rimrock, the thing he'd carried down the mountain inside his coat. I'm not going anywhere, you hear me? I'm right here. Send her away to be safe, or keep her, and watch the whole world he'd inherited come down on both their heads. I'll think on it, Wade said. His voice had gone strange. You do that. Hollis put his hat back on. September, son, committee meets the second Tuesday. He looked once more at Hope, still rumbling against Wade's grip, and something flickered in his face, and I swear to you it wasn't hatred. It was almost sorrow. Wild thing like that, he said, quieter. It's already dead, you understand. The minute it imprinted on a man, it just doesn't know it yet. Kindest thing you can do is the thing that hurts. And he got in his truck and drove away. And I realized with a cold turn in my gut that Hollis Brandt believed every word he'd said. That's the kind of enemy that ruins you, not the one who hates you, the one who's sure he's saving you. Wade didn't sleep that week. I know because I didn't either, and I could see his barn light from my window, burning all night, every night. He'd let Hope up onto the foot of his bed by then. Marisol scolded him for it, said you can't make a house dog of a wolf, but he did it anyway. And I think those nights he lay awake with his hand in her fur doing the arithmetic of his life over and over and getting a different answer every time. He came to me one evening gutted looking and laid it out plain. It's a good offer, Eli, he said, and his voice cracked on good. That's what's killing me. If he'd told me to shoot her, I'd have told him to go to hell and slept fine. But she'd be alive. She'd be safe. Up there behind a real fence with people who know what they're doing, with maybe other wolves, instead of stuck on a broke-down ranch with a man who doesn't know the first thing about her, waiting for the day somebody poisons her over the fence or the committee sends a warden out to put her down legal. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. What if keeping her is the selfish thing? What if Hollis is right and what if I'm just keeping her because I can't stand to lose her? And what's best for her is the crate and the pasture up north. What if loving something means you let it go to where it's safe even when it tears your guts out? And I sat there, and I want you to understand I didn't have an answer. I told him about the horse. I told him the smart things were the only things I regretted, but this wasn't the horse. The horse had been about my comfort dressed up as sense. This might really have been the better life for her. Behind a fence, far from Hollis, far from this hard country that wanted her dead. For the first time, I didn't know which way was the soft one and which was the cold one. They'd gotten so twisted around each other I couldn't tell them apart. So I told him the only honest thing I had. I don't know, son, I said. I genuinely don't. Anybody tells you they know for certain what's right here is selling you something. Maybe the sanctuary's the kindest thing. Maybe it'd break her, a wolf that's pack-bonded to a man, dropped in with strangers behind a fence. Maybe she'd grieve herself to nothing in a month. I don't know. You don't either. That's the hell of it. I put my hand on his shoulder. But I'll tell you what I do know. Hollis didn't offer you that sanctuary out of love for that wolf. He offered it because it's the cleanest way to get what he wants, which is you broke and grateful and his. Don't let the fact that the trap's got soft jaws fool you into thinking it isn't a trap. He nodded slow. It didn't fix anything. There wasn't a thing in the world that could have fixed it. Some choices don't have a right answer. They just have a price, and you pick which one you can carry. He'd nearly decided to take the deal. I'll be honest because the ledger demands it. By the second week of August, worn down to nothing, Wade had nearly decided to crate her up and send her north. He'd even called the sanctuary Holly's mentioned. It was real, a good place by all accounts, a woman up in the high country who'd taken in wolves and wolf dogs for 20 years. They had room. They'd take her. He'd written the date on the calendar in the kitchen in pencil like he couldn't bear to make it ink. Aug 23, Hope. And then Tobias Brant climbed a fence. It was a Saturday, hot, the kind of August afternoon where the whole valley goes still and yellow and the cattle stand in whatever shade they can find. Holly's grandson Tobias was staying the summer at the Brant place. His folks were splitting up, I learned later, and they'd shipped him off to Grandpa's the way families do with a kid who's underfoot during a bad season. 11 years old. Lonely. The kind of lonely that makes a boy wander. He'd heard about the wolf. Of course he had. The whole valley had. And to an 11-year-old boy stuck at his hard grandfather's ranch in a summer that was coming apart, a real live wolf one ranch over wasn't a danger. It was the most wonderful thing he'd ever heard of. So he walked 2 miles in the August heat, along the county road and then through the Peterson place to cut the corner, and he came up on Wade's land from the wrong side, the broken side, the side that backed up to the irrigation ditch and the old equipment graveyard, where Carl Coleman had let things go to rust for 30 years. There was a hand-dug irrigation cut back there, deep, the banks gone soft and undercut from years of water, fenced off because Carl knew it was dangerous, but the fence was as broke down as everything else Carl had left. Tobias went over the fence looking for the wolf. The bank gave way under him. Nobody saw it happen. He went down into the cut, 8, 9 feet of it, water in the bottom, sides too soft and steep to climb, and he hit something on the way down, his head or his arm, and he went into the water at the bottom dazed and couldn't get himself up the bank. And there was nobody on God's earth within shouting distance, and the water was cold and rising slow off the afternoon irrigation release upstream. A boy can drown in a foot of water if he can't get his feet under him. I've thought about it so many times since, how close it came, how nobody knew. Wade was out on the south end fixing the very fence Holly's calf story had been built on. I was home. Marisol was 3 counties over. There was not one human being who knew an 11-year-old boy was at the bottom of an irrigation cut on the back of the Coleman place, going under. But Hope knew. She'd been with Wade at the south fence, and Wade told me, he's told me a dozen times trying to make it make sense, that she just stopped, lifted her head, went rigid. And then she was gone, flat out across the home pasture toward the back of the property, toward the equipment graveyard, faster than he'd ever seen her move, and Wade yelled for her and she didn't even flick an ear, and he thought God forgive him. He thought she's going for stock, or she's running. She's finally running like everybody said she would. And he ran after her with his heart in his throat thinking the worst thought a man in his position could think. He found her at the lip of the irrigation cut. She was at the very edge, on the soft undercut bank that had already given way once, digging, scrabbling, throwing herself half over the edge and pulling back, and screaming. Wade said it wasn't a howl, wasn't a bark. It was a sound he'd never heard her make and hoped to never hear again. A sound like the one she'd made on the rimrock when he found her. The lost animal sound. The somebody is dying and I can't fix it sound, and Wade got to the edge and looked down and saw the boy. Tobias was barely up. He had one arm hooked over a half-buried fence post sticking out of the bank, and the water was at his chest, and his face was gray, and he wasn't yelling anymore. He was past yelling into the quiet part, the part that comes right before, and Wade said the only thing that kept him from going straight down that soft bank after him and getting them both killed was Hope, throwing her body sideways into his legs, herding him, the way she herded the cattle, away from the edge that had already collapsed once. Wade ran for the rope on the truck. It was the longest 30 seconds of his life, he says, leaving that boy in the water to go for the rope, not knowing if he'd come back to a face above the surface or below it. And the whole time Hope stayed at the edge on her belly now, stretched down the bank as far as her body would go, keeping the boy's eyes on hers. Wade swears it. Swears the only thing that kept Tobias's chin up those last seconds was a wolf 2 feet from his face, refusing to let him look away, refusing to let him go quiet, holding him there with nothing but the gold of her eyes. Wade got the rope down, got it around the boy, hauled him up the soft bank with his boots dug in and his whole body shaking, and when Tobias came over the lip he was coughing water and crying and alive, and hope was on him, not biting, not the thing every story in the valley said a wolf would do, licking the mud off his face, whining, pressing her whole body against his cold, shaking one, warming him the way she'd once needed warming, the way Wade had warmed her inside his coat coming down the mountain. The boy got his arms around her neck and held on like she was the only solid thing in the world. And Wade Coleman knelt in the mud at the edge of the cut that had nearly swallowed Holly's Brandt's grandson, with the boy and the wolf tangled together alive in front of him, and he understood all at once, the way the truest things arrive, that the calendar in his kitchen said Aug 23 and that he had been, that very week, 3 days from sending her north. He'd nearly given away the only reason that boy was going to grow up. I got the call an hour later. Wade, his voice gone strange and flat with shock, telling me to come and to come quick because Holly's Brandt was on his way. Because of course Wade had called him. You don't keep a near-drowned grandson from a man, no matter what that man's done to you. Wade had carried Tobias up to the house, wrapped him in every blanket Carl Coleman ever owned, set him by the wood stove with Hope pressed against him, still refusing to leave his side, and then he'd picked up the phone and called the one man in the world who wanted his wolf dead, and told him to come get his boy, who was alive. When I pulled up, Holly's truck was already there, slewed sideways in the drive the way a man parks when he's not thinking about parking. The front door stood open, and I came up onto that porch and looked through the doorway into the fire-lit front room of that broke-down ranch house, and I saw a thing I will carry to my own grave, right alongside Connie at the window and the empty corral. I saw Holly's Brandt on his knees on the floor. He had Tobias crushed against his chest, this big, hard, unhurried man, and he was not unhurried now. He was shaking. He was making the sounds a man makes when the worst thing in the world has come within an inch of him and then drawn back. And the boy was clinging to him and crying and talking, the words tumbling out the way they do from a child who's been to the edge and come back. Grandpa, Grandpa, the wolf saved me. She wouldn't let me go under. She kept looking at me, Grandpa. She kept me looking at her. And Holly's Brandt lifted his head, and he looked across that fire-lit room at the wolf he had spent all summer trying to destroy, the wolf that was lying now with her chin on his grandson's leg, watching him with those gold eyes, those eyes he'd called already dead. And his face came apart in a way I would not have believed that man's face could come apart, and he didn't say anything. He couldn't. There weren't words built for what was happening on his face. Wade stood off to the side by the wood stove, mud to his knees, saying nothing, letting the man have it. The way I'd taught him. The way you let a man find his own way back from the edge of feeling too much. And in the long quiet, with the fire popping and the boy crying himself out against his grandfather's chest, and the wolf keeping her steady gold watch over both of them, I understood that everything had changed and nothing was settled. Because a man like Holly's Brandt, brought to his knees on a stranger's floor by the very thing he'd sworn to destroy, that man owes a debt he doesn't know how to pay. And there is nothing in this world more dangerous or more unpredictable than a hard and prideful man who suddenly finds himself owing everything to the one creature he can't admit he was wrong about. The lease committee still met the second Tuesday of September. And Holly's Brandt still had to walk into that room full of men who'd heard all summer that Coleman's wolf was a killer, and decide, in front of every one of them, what kind of man he was going to be now that he knew the truth. The second Tuesday of September came in clear and cold, the first real edge of fall on it, and I drove Wade to the Cattlemen's Association meeting myself, because I didn't trust the boy's hands not to shake on the wheel. He dressed for it. That got me. Somehow, Wade had put on the one good shirt he owned, the one I think he'd buried his father in, pressed it with his own hands at the kitchen table that morning while Hope watched from the doorway. A man dresses up for two things in this country: funerals and judgment. Wade wasn't sure yet which one this was going to be. I want to set the room down the way it was, because the room mattered. The association met in the back of the Grange Hall, a long, low room with a wood floor scuffed gray by 60 years of boot heels, a ceiling fan that turned too slow to move any air, and a horseshoe of folding tables where the committee sat. Holly's at the center by right of the chair. 8 other men down the wings, every one of them a name that meant something, every one of them a man who'd known Carl Coleman and had spent the summer hearing that Carl's boy kept a killer in his barn. They'd come to watch. That's the thing about a hard country: bad news draws a crowd. The folding chairs along the back wall were full, men who had no business at a lease committee meeting but had heard there might be a reckoning, and you don't miss a reckoning in a place where the entertainment is thin. I saw the 2 from the feed store who talked about Blood'll Out. I saw Del Murphy. I saw faces that had decided how this was going to go before they ever sat down. Marisol was there too, in the back, arms crossed, jaw set. She'd closed the clinic to come. She caught my eye when we walked in and gave me a single small nod that meant I'm here, whatever it's worth, and it was worth something, to know the boy had 3 people in that room and not just 2. Wade and I took chairs near the front. Hope, of course, was home. You don't bring a wolf to your own trial, but she was in that room all the same. She was the only thing anybody was thinking about. They ran the dull business first. Grazing allotments, a fence dispute up in the high country, the price of the fall sales, the ordinary machinery of men managing land. And the whole time it ground along, I watched Holly's brand at the center of the horseshoe, and I could not read him, and that frightened me more than anything. Because here is what I knew, and what nobody else in that room knew except Wade and Marisol and me. 3 weeks earlier, that man had been on his knees on Wade Coleman's floor, broken open, his grandson's life handed back to him by the very animal he'd come there meaning to destroy. And here is what I did not know, what a man like Holly's does with a debt like that. I'd seen proud men brought low before. I'd watched the valley over 40 years, and I'll tell you the truth I learned from it: being saved doesn't soften every man. For some, the rescue is a humiliation they can't forgive. The thing that saved them becomes the witness to their smallest moment, and they'd sooner destroy the witness than live under its gaze. I'd half feared, in the worst of the nights since, that Holly's Brant would come to that meeting and bury Wade harder, that he'd need to prove, to himself most of all, that the wolf was still a killer, and his summer-long crusade had been right, because the alternative was admitting that he'd nearly murdered the thing that saved the only family he had left. A small man would have done that. I'd known plenty of small men wearing big hats. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was which kind Holly's Brant was going to turn out to be when it counted. Then the dull business ran out, and the chairman cleared his throat and called the lease renewals. And he started with Coleman. Wade Coleman's lease comes up for renewal, Holly said. His voice filled the room without trying. He had papers in front of him, he didn't look at them. Most of you've heard about it, I expect most of you came for it. A dry note in that: Holly's knew his audience. So let's not pretend. There's been talk all summer about this young man and an animal he's keeping. Talk that his judgment's not sound. Talk that he's let sentiment get in front of the operation. Talk that a Coleman calf got killed by the very wolf he took in. He let it hang. I'd imagine a good number of you walked in here today already knowing how you mean to vote. A murmur, heads nodding along the back wall. I felt Wade go rigid in the chair beside me, and I put my hand flat on his knee. Steady, son, let it come. And I watched the chairman of the Cattlemen's Association look down the horseshoe at 8 men who'd come to bury a boy, and I watched him decide who he was. I want to tell you all something, Holly said, and then we'll vote. He stood up. A man like Holly's doesn't stand to speak. He's got the chair. The chair speaks for him. Standing was a thing his body did without his committee's permission, and every man in that room felt the wrongness of it, the way you feel the ground change under you. The slow fan turned. Nobody moved. 3 weeks ago, Holly said, my grandson near drowned. The room went so quiet I could hear the fan's chain ticking against its housing. Tobias, my boy's boy, 11 years old, staying with me this summer on account of things at home being hard. He stopped, started again, and his voice was not the smooth uncle voice he'd used on Wade's porch in June. It was a rougher thing, scraped down to something I'd never heard out of him. He went wandering, the way a lonely boy does, and he went over a fence onto the back of the Coleman place, and the bank of an irrigation cut gave way under him, and he went down into 9 feet of it with the water rising and his head split open, and not one living soul who knew where he was. He looked straight down the room at Wade. And the only reason that boy is alive today, Holly's Brandt said, to a room full of men he'd run for 40 years, the only reason I am not standing over a grave this fall is that animal, Wade Coleman's wolf. She heard something none of us could have heard from a quarter mile off, and she ran to it, and she found my grandson going under, and she would not leave him. She held his eyes when he was ready to slip under and quit. She kept him warm when he came up half froze. The thing every one of you told me, the thing I told myself, the thing I came to that boy's door in June meaning to make him destroy. His voice broke. A grown man, the hardest in the county, and it broke clean in front of all of them, and he didn't try to hide it, and that, more than any word he said, was what turned the room. That animal saved my family, he said when he had himself. And I had spent the whole summer trying to have her killed, trying to dress it up as mercy so I could sleep. I stood on that boy's porch and I told him a wild thing that bonds to a man is already dead, and the kindest thing he could do was let it go. He shook his head slow, like a man trying to wake from something. I have never in my life been so wrong about anything, and I have got a grandson alive in my house to prove exactly how wrong, every single morning for the rest of my days. He sat back down. He picked up the papers in front of him, and his hands weren't quite steady, and he set them down again. Wade Coleman's lease renews, Holly said. Clean, full term, and it renews with my name on it, sponsoring in front of all of you, and any man at this table who's got a problem with that can take it up with me directly, and we'll see how it goes. He looked down the horseshoe, daring them, the old iron back in him now, fused to something new. Carl Coleman's boy is the soundest cattleman in this valley. He kept a thing alive that everybody told him to kill because he judged it was worth keeping, and he was right, and the rest of us were wrong, and it took a near-dead child to show us. That's not soft judgment, gentlemen. That's the only kind worth a damn. All in favor. 8 hands went up, some faster than others, but they all went up because you do not, in a country like ours, sit on your hands when Holly's Brandt has just laid his open chest on the table and dared you to. The vote was never really about the wolf in the end. It was about whether one proud man would tell the truth in a room that had come for a lie. And he did. It carried unanimous. Wade didn't move. I had to nudge him. He sat there in his dead father's good shirt with his mouth a little open, and I think the boy had braced so hard for ruin that the shape of being saved didn't fit through the door of him at first. Afterward, in the gravel lot, with the cold coming down and men filing out not quite meeting Wade's eyes, ashamed, most of them, in the quiet way of people who have been shown they were wrong and haven't worked out yet what to do about it, Holly's came over to where Wade and I stood by my truck. The two of them looked at each other. There was a whole summer between them. The calf, the porch, the slow pressure, the calendar in the kitchen that had said Aug 23 in pencil. I owe you an apology, son, Holly said, and I owe that animal a debt I can't pay. I know it. I'll be living with it. He worked his jaw. A man like that doesn't apologize twice in a decade, and he'd just done it in front of the whole association and was doing it again now private, which is harder. If there's ever a thing you need, a thing this valley can give a man, you come to me first. You understand? You come to me." Wade was quiet a moment, and then he did a thing I was proud of, prouder than near anything I'd watched him do that whole hard year. "She doesn't know she did anything, Mr. Brandt," Wade said. She heard a thing that was hurting and she couldn't stand to let it. That's all she is. That's all she's ever been." He looked the old man in the eye. "I don't need anything from you, but Tobias is welcome at my place any time he wants to come see her. A boy that lonely shouldn't be." He paused. "She'd like that. She decided he was hers the second she pulled him out. That's how she works. She just decides you're hers and then you are." I watched something move across Holly Brandt's hard old face at that. I think it was the understanding of what he'd nearly thrown away, sized up against what it had turned out to be. I think it was a man recalculating his whole long life's arithmetic about what's strong and what's soft, and which one keeps you alive at the bottom of a cold ditch. "He'll come," Holly said, rough. "He won't stop talking about her. His mother thinks he's made her up." A breath that was almost a laugh, almost not. "I'll bring him myself." And he did, but that's getting ahead. I want to tell you about the winter, because the winter is where I learned what the whole year had been about, and it wasn't about the lease or Hollies or even the rescue. The lease renewed. The herd went up to the high country the next summer and came down fat. The bank, with a sound lease in hand and Holly Brandt's name suddenly attached to the Coleman operation, found its way to being reasonable about Carl's old slid sideways loan. The ranch held. Wade Coleman did not become the Coleman who lost it. By every measure the valley uses to measure a man, he'd won, kept the land, kept the name, kept the wolf, and made an ally of the man who'd meant to break him. But that's not the part that matters. The valley's measures never are. Here's the part that matters. I was over there near every day that winter. I'd stopped pretending it was about the haying or the fences long since. The truth was the boy and the wolf had given me back something I'd buried with Connie 6 years before, which was a reason to get up and drive somewhere and be needed when I arrived. An old man alone learns to do without that. He shouldn't have to. I'd forgotten he shouldn't have to. And one evening in deep December, snow coming down soft and steady outside, the three of us were in that front room by the wood stove, me in Carl Coleman's old chair, Wade on the floor with his back against the couch, and Hope stretched out full length between us with her head in Wade's lap and her hind feet against my boot, twitching at some dream. The fire popped. The snow ticked at the glass. And I looked at that boy, who'd come down off a mountain a year before with a dying thing inside his coat, because he was too tired of watching things die to do the sensible thing one more time. I looked at him, easy and quiet and home in a way I'd never once seen him under his father's roof, and I finally understood the thing the title of this whole sorry, beautiful year should have been. Everybody thought the wolf would ruin him. They had it exactly backwards. The wolf didn't save the ranch. Holly's vote did that, and the rescue made the vote, and you could draw the line from cause to cause if you wanted to and call it luck or providence. But that's just events. That's just weather. The thing the wolf actually saved was the boy himself, and she'd done it long before the irrigation cut, done it that first gray April morning when she gave a grieving man with a knife in his hand something to keep alive instead of one more thing to watch die. He'd been drowning too. That whole long winter after Carl died, that's what I'd been watching from my porch and writing in my ledger and not finding the words for. Wade Coleman had been going under as surely as that boy in the ditch, quiet and alone with nobody who knew where he was, and a half-frozen pup the size of his fist had looked up at him out of the rocks and held his eyes and would not let him slip under and quit. She kept him looking at her. That's what she does. That's all she ever does. She finds the thing that's hurting and she will not let it go quiet. I asked him once, that winter, why Hope. He'd never said. He just stood in the pasture a year before and called her by it like it had been her name all along. He didn't answer right away. He had his hand in her fur, the way he always did, the way I think his hand had learned to do without asking the rest of him. "My dad's last week," he finally said, not looking at me, looking at the fire. He couldn't hardly talk by then, the lungs, but he had a good hour, one of the last ones, and he was lucid, and I was sitting with him, and I asked him. Wade's thumb moved slow through the gray fur. I asked him if he was scared. Stupid thing to ask a dying man, but I was 26 and I didn't know anything, and I asked him. He swallowed. And he looked at me and he said the only thing he was scared of was leaving me here alone with all of it. The ranch and the debt and the whole, all of it. He said, "I'm sorry, son. I'm leaving you nothing but a hard road and no hand to hold on it." The fire popped. Hope sighed in her sleep. "Those were near the last real words he said to me," Wade said. "No hand to hold on it. And I carried that around all winter like a stone, like he was right. Like I was just alone with the hard road, and that was the whole of my life now." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were bright but steady. "And then I'm up in the dries with a knife, about to do one more sensible cold thing in a life that was nothing but sensible cold things, and this nothing, this scrap of a half-dead thing looks up at me. And I swear to you, Eli, I swear, it wasn't that I felt sorry for it. It was that for the first time since the funeral I didn't feel alone with the hard road." He let out a breath that shook. "So I named her the thing my dad said I didn't have. I named her the thing he was sorry he couldn't leave me." He looked down at her, asleep between us, snow falling outside, the ranch quiet and held in his around them in the dark. "Turns out he was wrong about the one thing," Wade said. "He thought he left me with no hand to hold." A small broken laugh. "He just didn't know it was coming. He didn't know it was up in the rocks, waiting on me to be ready to carry it down." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't a thing to add. I've learned that much in 72 years. You let a man arrive at his own truth, and then you let it sit in the room with you, and you don't go cheapening it with your own. I drove home through the snow that night with my chest full of something I didn't have a word for, and I got out my ledger, the way I have every night of my life, and I sat at Connie's old kitchen table to write the day down.